Hello! This is Belvoir Castle in the Vale of Belvoir in eastern England, one of the most beautifully situated English stately homes. It's been the ancestral home of the Manners family for over 500 years. The name Belvoir is a corruption of the French Belvoir, or beautiful view, named by the incoming Norman conquerors. But the local Saxons struggled to pronounce it, and eventually the name Belvoir emerged. Arriving here at the pre-guardroom entrance, the visitor is confronted by this awesome display of Brown Bess musketry, brought here in the 19th century by the 4th Duke when he had been Governor of Ireland. Permission to keep this awesome display of weaponry was probably given by the Duke of Wellington because he was a family friend and he often visited this castle. Passing here into this great space, you enter the main guard room, designed in Gothic style by James Wyatt, and including more muskets and swords from the 21st Dragoons, a unit formed by the Marquis of Granby. Above hang the banners of the members of the Manners family who were created Knights of the Garter by the reigning monarch, and these banners would have hung in the Garter Chapel in Windsor Castle during their lifetimes. As you ascend the grand staircase, you meet the lady responsible for much of the glory in this present house, Elizabeth Howard, wife of the 5th Duke, and both their portraits hang at the top of these stairs. She is holding an architect's notebook signifying her passionate interest in many aspects of architecture, art and interior design. She worked with Sir John Thornton and was determined to create an impressive ballroom. And this is the ballroom, the beautiful creation of Elizabeth Howard with Sir John Thornton. She always wanted to have a beautiful space like this, and this ballroom is unusual because it's inspired by the architecture of Lincoln Cathedral. This is a portrait of Lord Robert Manners, Captain Lord Robert Manners, who was killed fighting the French in 1782. The surgeon's knife that was used in an unsuccessful attempt to save his life is on display in a nearby cabinet. Ooh! This is one of the Chinese rooms, decorated beautifully with hand-painted 18th century Chinese silk. The bed is covered with green damask and a beautiful silk bedspread. Special arrangements can be made for interested groups to have dinner and stay overnight in one of these beautifully restored state rooms. This is the Elizabeth Saloon, probably the most sumptuous room in the castle, full of gaiety and life. It was the room that the ladies would retire to after dinner to gossip. The decoration is wonderful. And the roof, the ceiling above is a masterpiece, again by James Wyatt, depicting figures from Greek and Roman mythology. And here is a beautiful statue of Elizabeth Howard, wife of the 5th Duke, carved in Carrara marble by James Wyatt. This is the state dining room. It's dominated by a ceiling, which is a copy of a ceiling in the church of Santa Maria Maggiore in Rome. The room is dominated by two great Sir Joshua Reynolds portraits, one of the 4th Duke. The other portrait is the Marquis of Granby, famous for his bald-headed charge at the Battle of Warburg, from which comes the phrase, going at it, bald-headed. His compassion for his wounded ex-soldiers led him to establish pensions, from which many purchased inns, and that accounts for all across England today the many Marquis of Granby inns. Good health, your lordship. The picture gallery contains many fine paintings, including a Holbein portrait of Henry VIII and some beautifully sensitive dog portraits by the equestrian master George Stubbs. There are also 5 superb paintings based on the 7 Sacraments by Nicholas Poussin. A fine Elizabeth rosewater dish and ewer sit in a retractable display case. Unusually for a gallery, there is also a superbly restored Queen Anne bed, brought here from Haddon Hall and bearing the marks Catherine, Countess of Rutland. These are the King's Rooms, lavishly decorated with hand-painted wallpapers, especially attractive to the Prince Regent's Oriental tastes. And this is the King's Bed, so called because monarchs have slept in this bed, especially Queen Victoria and Prince Albert. And Queen Victoria herself may well have sat at this table admiring herself. When Queen Victoria's son, Edward VII, came to stay here, they had to widen the passageway to allow for his large girth. And this is the dressing room, including this beautiful 18th century cot in which a royal baby may once have lain. It has this really ornate swan's neck head. The Regent's Gallery is the longest and most magnificent room in the castle. Named after the Prince Regent, it is decorated with a very fine set of Louis XVI Gobelin tapestries. They tell the story of Don Quixote, and each is topped by a peacock, which also appears on the manor's family crest.
So it's fascinating, really, how tea was invented here at Belvoir Castle, my home. When the Duchess of Bedford was here visiting the 5th Duke and Duchess, sometime in the 1800s, apparently the gentlemen were out hunting and the ladies had a moment in the afternoon that needed to be filled. And the Duchess of Bedford had a rather heady sort of quality to her afternoon. So they invented the idea of having a snack and a cup of tea. So it may well have happened where they had their first afternoon tea in the Regent's Gallery, which is where they're having tea today. We have got in the Steward's Restaurant today what I feel is a really rather more heavy version, but as close as possible, a replica of the tea service that they would have eaten and drunk their tea from. And that is available in our shop, so while you're staying with us, you can leave with the very own tea set that they would have had on that day here for the first afternoon tea. We bought these extraordinary sets of china, and we have lovely cake trays, and we serve our afternoon tea from our Steward's Restaurant here in the castle. And that's a way that you can almost link back in time and imagine.
Here we've got one of his bills.
Oh yes.
Now this is the tea for the Duke of Rutland's personal consumption, so we get an idea what his taste was in tea
Oh.
in the 1840s.
And what do we have?
Here we are He is buying Hyson tea and souchong.
Oh, right. So it seems quite significant and a probability that the Duchess of Bedford was the instigator of the great tradition of English afternoon tea.
That's the story, that's our story, and we're sticking to it.
I think you should. Wonderful.
The castle chapel takes the visitor back to the very beginnings of Belvoir Castle. At the back is the ancient tombstone of Robert de Todini, standard bearer to William the Conqueror at the Battle of Hastings, an event celebrated in the Bayeux Tapestry. So it was William the Conqueror who decreed that Robert should have the Bellevue. The castle kitchens still retain the original fire range and spit, reflecting the needs to supply food to such a large household. To one side is the butter kitchen, and here lurks one of Belvoir's darker secrets of alleged 17th century witchcraft. In preparation for a visit by King James I, a king who himself had studied witchcraft, the 6th Earl hired extra kitchen staff, including 3 local girls, a mother and 2 daughters, the Flowers girls. They were unpopular, accused of stealing, and were dismissed. Soon after, the Earl and his wife fell ill with the vomiting sickness, and later his children, particularly Henry, his heir. He died. Soon after, the other 2 children fell ill, Catherine and Francis died. Now this was the time of witchcraft trials, and the Duke soon suspected the Flower girls were the culprits. They were arrested, and under examination they confessed that they had cast spells using their familiar, a cat named Rudderkin. At the trial, they were found guilty and hung from the castle walls. Some think that an important noble, George Villiers, had the children poisoned. And that was because he had intentions on the daughter, Catherine. And sure enough, he did later marry Catherine and become Lord of Belvoir. The 6th Earl buried his 2 sons in a magnificent tomb in Bottisford Church, the only tomb in England to have the reference witchcraft. Belvoir occupies an idyllic position in the Vale of Belvoir, and it was in the 1790s that the great landscape gardener, the ageing Capability Brown, was summoned to landscape the gardens and enclose the surrounding park with a great green girdle of trees. He also created fine avenues of trees radiating from the castle and a series of interconnecting lakes in the great visual tradition of the painter Claude and the English country park. Its spectacular rooms provide a wonderful backdrop for conferences, concerts, fashion shows, weddings, dinners and celebrations. Above all, it is still Belvoir Castle, the ancestral home of the Duke and Duchess of Rutland, the Bellevue.